Hello. This article is presented by Cameron Barlow and I, Stephen Colvin. The title of this article is called Improving Executive Function of Children with Autism Spectrum Disorder Through Cycling Skill Acquisition. It is by TC, and I'm sorry if I butchered the name, but Anderson, Lau, and Sui. The overall goal of this article was to understand if certain exercise interventions can improve children with autism spectrum disorder, cognition, and functioning. The researchers examined a meta-analysis by Alvarez Bueno, which observed the effect of physical exercise on children's cognition and metacognition, with the findings of that article being that physical exercise benefits multiple components in executive function. Other research done mentioned in this article by Ringenbach and Bremer showed that assisted cycling therapy and a circuit-based workout led to improved inhibition control and cognitive planning. Inhibition control. Sorry about that. The issue with most of the studies mentioned in the article were the low sample amount, and some studies were with developing children from 15 through 19 without autism spectrum disorder. And another issue is the limited research of the benefits of physical exercise on executive functioning in children with autism spectrum disorder. Not alone, we can't forget about the low numbers, like there wasn't that many people. They had a low overall total amount of people to participate, a low N number. So, for example, the research mentioned by Alvarez Bueno was a meta-analysis of 36 different studies, and it totaled a number of 3,805 participants, but they were without mainly autism spectrum disorder. They were just developing children mainly. And there was a research by Bremer that only had a number of 12 male children with autism spectrum disorder, and these numbers are relatively low to determine conclusive results, but it gives our current researchers a basis to work off of to conduct their own research. Autism spectrum disorder is a neurodevelopment disorder generally distinguished in early childhood. The latest prevalence of autism spectrum disorder in Hong Kong is 1.5%, although it is predicted to increase. These children usually have discrepancies in social communication and interaction, having restricted and repetitive behavior, interests, activities, as well as executive dysfunction, and is broadly reported and has been hypothesized as a neuropsychological feature in autism spectrum disorder population. The components of executive function can break down to planning, flexibility, working memory, and inhibition. Planning is a process that identifies and organizes a sequence of steps to achieve a goal. An example of planning would be having to get up for work earlier than usual because of traffic, or you might have to get gas before work. There's certain steps that you need to take care of rather than just jumping out of bed and leaving the house. Flexibility is the ability to switch attention between tasks. Working memory refers to the capacity to hold and manipulate information in mind across a short period. And inhibition refers to the ability to suppress or avoid a prepotent response to make a less automatic but task-relevant response. Children with ASD or autism spectrum disorder show many deficits in the components of executive function, such as inflexibility in switching between rules or governing their behavior, or even changing conversational topics. It could result in social impairments. Excuse me. They have deficits in working memory, and it limits the capacity to hold task-relevant information in mind and contribute to maladaptive emotional behaviors and difficult problem-solving scenarios. So due to the lack of conclusive studies with the inconclusive results in the ones that are relevant revolving around physical activity in children with autism spectrum disorder, the researchers wanted to compare the changes in 4 components of executive functioning, which were planning, working memory, flexibility, and inhibition, using 2 modes of physical exercise interventions. Several studies which typically developing children have shown that acute bouts of exercise and chronic exercise have positive effects on executive function. But the current trials were too short to induce the change in the brain structure and function thought to underlying changes in executive function in children exposed to chronic exercise interventions. The post-test interventions were too long after the end of the trial for the children to acquire the benefits of the increased blood flow to the brain. With that current information, the researchers hypothesized that in their study, learning to ride a bicycle would require a higher cognitive effort and therefore benefit executive function more than stationary cycling. They were uncertain whether stationary cycling would lead to a significant improvement in executive functioning. So, in this study, they randomly assigned participants to one of three groups. First, learning to ride a bicycle, which is cognitively engaging exercise. Secondly, stationary cycling, which is a non-cognitive engaging exercise. And third, being no exercise, which they considered the control group. They chose learning to ride a bike because it was a development appropriate but challenging physical exercise which facilitates children to play with their friends and family while extending their social networks. It is also deemed a natural and common physical exercise and has been shown proven achievable to teach children with autism to ride a bike. Cycling has also been shown to increase children's physical exercise level and improve their social behavior. It's important to note that learning to ride a bike is physically and cognitively demanding, and it aligns with the cognitive stimulation hypothesis. Each participant took 2 assessments where they assessed different components of their executive function. The cognitive assessments were completed on 2 successive days, and each assessment lasted for about 30 minutes to prevent the fatigue in their cognition of the participants. The 2 assessments were taken 2 days before intervention, which was labeled T1 in our chart that we'll see later, and it's called pre-intervention, and 1 day after the 2-week-long cycling interventions or regular treatment, which is labeled T2 or post-intervention. There was initial 77 participants who were recruited for this study from 3 local special schools for children with mild intellectual disabilities with parent recommendations. There was also an inclusion criteria, which were the following: 8 to 12 years old, mild to moderate autism spectrum disorder, nonverbal IQ over 40, using a brief version of the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, and I think it was translated in Chinese. They were able to follow instructions with the assistance of the research staff. They were able to perform the requested physical intervention and executive function measures with the assistance of the research staff. They had no additional regular participation in physical exercise other than school physical education classes for at least 2 months before the study, and novice at riding a 2-wheel bike, and those were all the inclusion criteria that they had to meet to be able to participate in this study. There was also an exclusion criteria, which goes as the following: other medical conditions that limited physical exercise capacities, such as asthma or maybe seizures and cardiac disease, a complex neurologic disorder like epilepsy or Fragile X syndrome or tuberous sclerosis, suffering from obesity. So like if they were to fall off the bike, the researchers would struggle to help them get up if they were beginning to fall. And I think that was everything in the exclusion criteria that they had to meet, or if they fell into one of these categories, that they could not participate in the study. And another one that they couldn't do was self-reported colorblindness. So if they were colorblind, just for the specific tests talked about later in this presentation, they weren't going to be able to do it to their full capacity because of the color blindness, and we'll talk about those specific tests later. So after the screening was done, only 66 participants joined the study, but 4 ended up dropping out, in which 2 were from the control group and 2 were from the stationary bicycling group. And with that being said, there was a total of 62 total participants who successfully completed the study. All the participants had written consent from their parents or guardians at the time, and the study was also approved by the university's ethics committee. So, in the Learning to Ride the Bike group, there was a total of 19 boys and 3 girls. It was an intervention that lasted for 2 weeks bicycle training program. It consisted of 10 sessions, 5 per week, 60 minutes per session, and it was located in a hall or gymnasium of each of the participating schools and the Education University of Hong Kong. Each session was managed by a professional cycling instructor assisted by student helpers, and the professional cycling instructor had to have an experience of five years or more. The staff to participant ratio was 1-to-1, so for each participant there was a staff member. And each individual session was conducted in an identical format, and it comprised of 3 activities: a warm-up, the bike training, and the cool down. And the warm-up was 10 minutes, the bicycle training was 40 minutes, and the cool down was 10 minutes as well. So 60 minutes total, split into 3 activities. Participants were asked to ride on a training bike, with training wheels to gain better control of the bike in a gradual way, then progress to a 2-wheel bike. So they started with bike with training wheels, and then as they got more comfortable or as they advanced, they went to a regular 2-wheel bike. They were asked to ride through an obstacle course that was progressively more difficult to navigate. And the obstacles were designed by a focus group, which consisted of 4 physical education teachers from the participating schools and 1 experienced cycling coach. And again, the coach had to have 5+ years of experience, so 5 or more years of experience. Because most of the participants were reluctant to wear their heart rate monitors, the exercise intensity level was mainly managed by asking the RPE every 10 minutes, and the target range that they were looking for was a 3 to 5. The participants were positively reinforced, for their efforts throughout the session. So they just were encouraged throughout each session just to make sure, hey, just keep going. You're almost there. You're doing it. Just to help them out. So, let me pause. When we look at the stationary cycling group, it consisted of 16 boys and 4 girls. This group received a identical duration, the manpower, the warm-up, and the cool down. So they tried to keep everything the same, except for it was a stationary cycling program rather than a regular bicycle. The participants were also asked every 10 minutes during exercise to indicate their RPE, still being a target range from 3 to 5. And just like the Learning to Ride the Bike group, they were also positively reinforced verbally with compliments for their efforts in the training program. Now, the control group consisted of 15 boys and 5 girls. So now we notice in this specific study that there are more boys than girls in it. And totaling that there's only 62 in total, it's still a relatively low amount, but it's higher than most of the research that's out there. So they're trying to add more participants with the same disorder. So in a way, it's really a good thing, but there still could be more participants. So the control group consisted of 15 boys, 5 girls, and they received no cycling activity, and they were asked to maintain their normal routine, no additional physical activity during the study, and then after the study, they were compensated by being taught how to ride the bike. It was a way to recognize their contributes as a control group. So they got awarded for essentially doing their normal routine and no extra physical activity. When we look at planning, it was assessed by using a computerized Tower of London task, and it's been used previously with children with autism spectrum disorder. The participants were presented a structure of yellow, green, and red balls on 3 pegs of different lengths. They were instructed to move the balls to match the target peg arrangement in a specific amount of moves according to the pre-specified rules. The task was halted if there were 3 consecutive failed trial attempts. The level of task difficulty and the restriction on number of moves were progressively higher over time as task difficulty and restrictions on moves increased. Children were required to plan further ahead to ensure they matched the target peg arrangement without violating the task rules and restrictions. Scores for children generally planning ability were calculated by summing the correct tasks performed out of the 12 trials given, and the scores totaled from a range of 0 to 36. A higher score deemed better planning ability. Working memory was assessed by the Corsi block tapping test, the forward digit span, and the backwards digit span test. These were used to measure capacities of visual spatial working memory and auditory working memory, and they've been used previously with children with autism spectrum disorder. In the Corsi block tapping test, participants were at first asked to observe the sequence of blocks being tapped, and then they were asked to repeat the same sequence in the order. The initial sequence length was 3 blocks, but the sequence lengths increased by 1 after every 2 trials. The task ended after 2 incorrectly repeated sequences of the same length, and the longest correctly repeated sequence was recorded. The longer the sequence length, the larger the number of items that could be stored in the working memory, and the higher the visual spatial working memory capacity. The digit span tests were presented at a rate of 1 digit per second, and participants were required to repeat the sequence verbally. The initial sequence length was 2, and the sequence length increased by 1 after every 2 trials. The test ended after 2 incorrectly repeated sequences of the same length, and the maximum digit span was established. Just like the Corsi block tapping task, the longer the span that the participants could memorize meant the higher their working memory capacity was. When we're looking at flexibility, the Stroop color and word test was used because it has been previously used to measure cognitive flexibility in healthy and autism spectrum disorder populations. The participants are required to read 3 different tables as fast as they can. The 3 different tables were classified into 2 conditions, congruent and incongruent conditions. The congruent conditions require participants to first read the name of the colors presented in black, represented by a W, and name different colors patches, represented by C. Following that, they were asked to read the 3rd table where words are printed in different colors. For example, the word blue is printed in red ink or yellow in green ink, and that was represented by CW. The cognitive flexibility score, which is represented by the interference score, is IG, and a formula was created, which is IG equals CW minus parentheses WC, parentheses W minus C. This formula was used because it has been the most frequently used in previous studies. The lower the IG, the better the cognitive flexibility. So the lower the interference score, the better the cognitive flexibility. The higher, the worse. Inhibition is the participant's ability to inhibit unwanted responses to changing stimuli. This was measured by a computerized go, no-go task, and it was identical to the one used by TC for this trial. This task required participants to press a left or a right key as quickly as possible when the arrow appeared on the center of the computer screen, and not to press any key whenever the up arrow appeared on the screen. So the left or right key was a go response, and the up arrow was a no-go response. There are a total of 20 practice trials, and the participants completed 300 trials. 220 of the trials were requiring a go response, 110 were left and 110 were right, and 80 of the trials, about 26.7%, required a no-go response, which was not pressing any key at all. The stimulus were randomly presented one at a time for 500 milliseconds, followed by 1,000 milliseconds of blank intervals after blocks of 60 trials. Children were offered about a 2-minute break, and no feedback were given upon the response. And the response times was recorded but not analyzed because of the unreliability of the recording procedure. A familiar study by Uzi Folksky showed a go response and a no-go trial was coded as a false alarm. And a false alarm errors are considered an indicator of inhibition. The lower, the better. Alright, so looking at this chart, it shows at the very top where it says initial recruitment, there was a total of 77 participants, and that was starting off. When it drops, you see the arrow drop down, it says screened and met criteria. That was the 66. So you could tell that 10 people didn't match the criteria after the screening. Out of those 66 people, you see in the block to the right where it says block randomization, block size of 2 was used. It was randomized into the 3 different groups. The first group being the learning to bicycle group, which had an initial of 22. The stationary cycling group, which had an initial of 22. And the control group, which had an initial of 22. After T1, which is the pre-intervention test, so it's the 1 week pre-intervention assessment, the cognitive assessment. If you look to the block to the right of T1 and then to the left, that block shows that how 2 participants of the stationary cycling group and 2 participants of the control group dropped out. So after the pre-intervention assessment, cognitive assessment, we drop down and you see that 4 participants dropped midway. You look at our new group. So we got 22 people in the learning to bicycle group. We got 20 people in the stationary cycling group and 20 people in the control group. And right under there, you see the T2, which is the post-intervention assessment, which is 1 week after the cycling interventions. So you can see how he started out with 77. After the screening and criteria, we have 66. After that, they're randomized into 3 groups. After the 1 week pre-intervention, 4 people dropped out, dropping our groups down to only 22, 20, and 20.
Throughout each exercise, they measured several things. For the bicycle group, they measured the exercise intensity level. So for that, every 10 minutes during the exercise, they would ask the participant to indicate their rate of perceived exertion. Rate of perceived exertion is just a range of how much longer they can go. For the stationary cycling group, they also measured the same thing. But the difference between the two, the bicycle group, they would have to learn how to ride the bicycle and pedal, whereas a stationary cycling group, you would only have to learn how to pedal. For the working memory, they would measure the capacity of visual spatial working memory and auditory working memory. They did this by asking the participants to watch the sequence of blocks being tapped on, and then they were asked to repeat the sequence in order. The initial sequence length was about 3 blocks, and after every 2 trials, the sequence length would be increased by 1. The task ended after 2 incorrectly repeated sequences on the same length, and the longest correctly repeated sequence length was recorded. From the data they collected, they measured the inhibition by the participants' ability to inhibit unwanted responses to changing stimuli. They would press a left or right key as quickly as possible when the corresponding arrow appeared on the center of the computer screen. For flexibility, they measured the cognitive flexibility in healthy and ASD populations. All they did was have the participant read 3 different tables as fast as they could. So how do they analyze their data? They analyzed their data by inputting all the stats in the statistical package for social sciences. So a research assistant put all the data into this package. Basically, the package is for social sciences is a software package used to analyze the data for the researchers. And how did they interpret the results? It revealed improvements in all the executive function components in the learning to ride a bicycle group, but not in the other two groups after controlling for age and IQ. Overall, the results indicated that physical exercise programs benefit multiple components of executive function, including working memory, selective attention, inhibition, and cognitive flexibility. For discussion, one of the strengths of the study was that it incorporated a comprehensive assessment of executive function. There were further investigation after this just because there were still issues that were needed to be known. First, they didn't measure how much the intervention groups were engaging their cognitive faculties. They could not state categorically the participants felt cognitive effort or cognitive engagement was the only factor causing gains in the learning group without a measurement of participants' perceived cognitive effort or cognitive engagement. Future research should think about using these metrics. Second, neither the stress levels of the participants nor the degree of social contact between their personal and their participants were assessed in the study. So in conclusion, the study showed that cognitively engaging exercise benefits executive function in children with ASD, whereas non-cognitive engaging exercise does not. So the findings provide teachers with a novel method to improve the executive function in children with ASD. Teachers can redesign physical education programs to bring additive cognitive benefits to children with ASD to involve them in everyday life.